because they were online, is that right? Great. Well, good evening and welcome to members, officers, the press and public joining the Strategic Development Committee. The meeting is being live streamed on YouTube, so welcome to those viewing us online, either now or after the fact. Most officers are joining this evening's meeting via Zoom. Can I check that those on Zoom can hear me? Great, thank you. And those in the room can hear me, I assume?
Yes.
Thank you. You may want to take a seat near one of the microphones, Memo, just so that we can hear you.
Yeah.
There's one here at the front.
The front, okay.
And one here as well.
That's not sure.
Most officers, as I said, are joining this evening's meeting via Zoom. My name is Rachel Tripp. I'm the chair of the Strategic Development Committee. For members in the room, as ever, when you're speaking, can you please speak clearly and loudly so the microphone can pick up what you say? For those joining us by Zoom, please mute your microphone if you're not speaking. I'm now going to ask the members of the committee to introduce themselves.
My name's John Morris. I'm councillor for Plaster West and Kennington East, and I'm a member of this committee.
Hello, my name is Madeline Sali-Puntin. I'm councillor for Forest Gate South and I'm a member of this committee.
My name is Councillor Mahmoud Mirza. I'm from Boleyn Ward and I'm a member of this committee as well.
Thank you. Can I welcome Mahmoud Mirza to his first meeting of the Strategic Development Committee?
Thank you.
I just want to remind members that when a vote is taken, it will be by way of raising our physical hands in order that we can capture this on camera. Item number 1 on the agenda is apologies. We've received apologies today from councillors Masara Alam, Carleen Lee Parkway, Charlene McLean, Susan Masters and Harvinder Singh Verdi. Are there any additional apologies received? Thank you. The next item is the minutes of the meeting held on the 19th of March for approval. Were there any matters arising or any matter of accuracy pertaining to these minutes?
No, Chair.
In which case, can we accept these as a true record?
Agreed.
Great.
Thank you. The next item is declarations of interest. Are there any additional declarations of interest?
Yes, Chair. The application in front of us is in my ward, Plaster West and Kennington East.
Thank you.
And I would also request a change to the report to reflect that. I can't remember the specific page, but it notes that's in Kennington North and not Plaster West and Kennington East.
I'm sure we can make sure that happens. And as ever, the minutes will reflect the fact that you're a ward councillor, but that doesn't prevent you from taking place in the discussion and voting.
Thank you.
Item number 4 is determining planning applications. We're asked to note the advice from the head of legal services. Is that noted?
Noted.
Thank you. Item number 5, announcements from the chair. Please note, as ever, the full consideration and planning assessment of matters is covered comprehensively in our committee report. I know members will have had full regard to the committee report, so the officer presentation will be a summary of the key issues only. We've received no requests today to address the committee. However, the applicant for our only application has asked us to read his statement, which is outlined in the officer update report and was circulated to members earlier today. Can I please call on Liam Haddon, who's the case officer for you, to present item 6 to the committee.
Thank you, Chair. Just bear with me while I share screen. Okay, can I confirm you can all see that?
Not yet. Oh, yes, here we are. Yes, we
Okay.
can.
Thank you. Yes, this is item 6, Colliery House. So this location of it is in the west of the borough. And the proposal is for the demolition of the existing church buildings and erection of a new mixed-use development of 3, 5 and 6 stories to provide a community use, 80 self-contained flats and associated amenity space, refuse storage, cycle parking. So to help you with this application, we've set out a timeline of the application and the site history. So to begin with, the first application was submitted in October 2020. It's for an identical application to the one before you today. So as you can see there, the description is the same. In March 2021, this was presented to the SDC, who refused it for a number of reasons. Those were the failure to demonstrate that no affordable housing was the maximum reasonable amount, The failure to demonstrate the added value of the tall building element outside of a tall building zone, and the density, height, and massing were also considered excessive. In April 2021, a subsequent application was submitted. This was identical to the previous one, but provided some additional justification in terms of viability. This was reviewed by BNP Paribas, who did not agree with this justification. The application was then brought to STZ in May 2021. Members decided to defer the application to allow the applicant some time to reconsider the level of affordable housing. The applicants did that. They revised the scheme to provide 10 units, which equates to 12.5% of affordable housing. This was again reviewed by BNPP, who considered this was a viable amount of affordable housing. In September 2021, the case was presented again to STC. Officers then recommended approval. The consideration was that the uplift in affordable housing was able to outweigh the other concerns raised in the previous refusal. Members accepted that recommendation and resolved to approve permission. In February 2023, the legal agreement was signed and the decision was finally issued. The application is extant and it expires in February 2026. Which brings us to the current application. This is identical to the previous scheme, however, it does not provide any affordable housing provision. It's therefore identical to the previously refused scheme from March 2021. And just a note here that the pre-application advice service wasn't engaged with, so there was no prior engagement with officers before the application was submitted. BNPP again reviewed the application, however, they disagreed with the applicant's viability assessment. They consider that the proposal can have 12.5% affordable housing and remain viable. And that brings us to today with a refusal recommendation. So here are some key visuals. The design of the application hasn't changed since the previously approved scheme. And these are some CGIs to give you an idea of how that would look in the street. In terms of consultation, 362 neighbouring properties were consulted and site notices were erected around the site. We received 3 objections. They can be summarised as concerns over overlooking and privacy, impact on refuse and parking services, loss of light, impact on the noise of development, and the design and impact on the local heritage asset, which is Fairburn Hall. The key considerations for the application are the principal development, affordable housing, housing mix, employment, design, heritage, impact on amenity, quality of accommodation, urban greening, transport, and energy and sustainability. Beginning with the principal development, the residential use of the proposal was already established in the previous application. Our current policies support residential development within this area, so there are no objections to this element of the proposal. In terms of the community use, there would be a reduction of the existing use because of the loss of the church that is on site at the moment. There is a policy requirement that any loss of community space is justified or mitigated through re-provision. Any unjustified loss of community space can be harmful to the council's aims to provide inclusive communities and can be considered harmful to the quality of life of residents. In the previous application, this loss was accepted based on information that was provided with the application about the existing church use and the lack of interest in any other potential providers such as the NHS, LBN Education or social services. The applicant has submitted that same information again. However, this is dated between August 2018 and September 2019. We should also note that the planning statement refers to outdated policies such as the previous London Plan 2016. Given the importance of community space in policy terms and within the borough, it's important that any information is robust and justifies the loss of the community space. The officer's opinion is that the information is outdated and therefore is no longer robust and cannot be relied upon. I'll just pause here briefly on that last point. You'll see it come up several times in this presentation, just to stress that the onus is always on the applicant to make the best case when they submit an application. It's not for the planning department or officers to ensure that information is still relevant. It really does lie with the applicant. So moving on to affordable housing, the proposal would contain no affordable housing. So it's obviously a reduction from the 12.5% previously secured. The application has provided some justification of this in an updated viability assessment. This largely factors in increase in material costs and building costs since the previous application was approved. That has been assessed again by BNP Paribas. However, they have disagreed with the conclusions and they consider that the proposal would still be viable with the inclusion of 12.5% affordable housing. Given that the extant permission provides that, and BNPP still consider this viable, officers would not support any revised affordable housing offer which is less than the 12.5% previously secured. On that basis, officers consider that the applicant has failed to demonstrate it would achieve the maximum amount of affordable housing reasonable for the development, and this forms a reason for refusal. In terms of housing mix, the application would provide a mix of unit sizes, including 41% of family-sized units, which would comply with policy and would be acceptable. Likewise, the proposed drop-in centre would provide some employment, and had the application been acceptable, we would have secured this through a Section 106 obligation for contributions towards 33 construction jobs and apprenticeships. So that would also comply with policy and would be acceptable. In terms of design, the overall massing, layout and architecture is the same as the previously proposed scheme and remains acceptable in broad terms. However, the proposal would be a tall building and is outside of a tall building zone or town centre location. Local policy SP4 requires that tall buildings outside of those designated areas must be robustly justified with either significant public realm improvements or via contributions towards balanced and mixed communities. This is sometimes known as the added value of the tall building. In the previous application that was identical to this and was refused, part of the reason for refusal, as touched upon earlier, was the lack of affordable housing. I've got a quote there from the officers report from that application. So it just noted that by not providing any affordable housing, it failed to meet the council's objectives for mixed and balanced communities. So I would just note here that affordable housing is not in isolation of that. Affordable housing contributes towards mixed and balanced communities. So the current proposal fails to provide any affordable housing, as noted, it's refuted by BNPP as being the maximum reasonable amount. And therefore, the lack of affordable housing results in a tall building which fails to contribute towards mixed and balanced communities and fails to provide that added value. It also does not provide any significant public realm improvements. On that basis, this forms a reason for refusal. In terms of amenity impacts, the application is the same as previously approved. There's been no significant changes in the local area in terms of new developments which would change those outcomes. The daylight and sunlight assessment remains relevant in this case, and therefore the impacts are considered to be acceptable as they were previously. Similarly, the heritage impacts on nearby listed building are considered to be minimal. This has been supported by GLASS, that's the Greater London Archaeological Advisory Service, and Historic England, and there's been no objections from LBN's heritage officers. In terms of quality of accommodation, all units would meet minimum standards. They would all have access to private balconies of an appropriate size and depth. There would be a shared courtyard provided, and the majority of units would be dual aspect. So this again remains acceptable. Urban greening. So London Plan Policy G5. This was a policy introduced in the newer London Plan, which is not referred to in any of the submitted documents. This requires new development to meet an urban greening factor of 0.4. The application form has a section on this, and it does state that the application would achieve 0.4. However, there are no plans or supporting information to substantiate this. So typically we would have something similar to a landscape plan, and it demonstrates how that factor is calculated because it is a very formulaic system giving points to various sort of bits of green infrastructure which contribute to that. None of the documents refer to this policy, so it's not clear how the applicant has arrived at that conclusion that it would meet that factor. On the basis of that information, we say it hasn't been able to demonstrate compliance with policy G5, and this is another reason for refusal. In terms of transport and travel, transport would be car-free other than blue badge. 145 cycle spaces would be provided in accordance with London Plan requirements, and those elements of the application remain acceptable. However, the transport assessment is dated September 2020. LBN transport officers have reviewed this document, but they note that the document predates the current London Plan. It does not make reference to current census data. So for clarity, the census data would include stuff like car use, and that's why it's important for transport assessments. There are newer site samples available on the TRIX database. So this is a database that applicants can use to look at other examples of similar developments that are approved in the country and have an idea of what impacts they may have on the transport network. Transport officers also don't consider that any on-street parking surveys dated from 2018 to be robust to justify the proposal. And in addition, we have now published travel plan guidance, which was published last year, and that hasn't been taken into account. On that basis, we consider that the transport assessment is not robust or sufficient enough to demonstrate compliance with current policy, and this again forms a reason for refusal. Similarly here, an energy strategy has been submitted, but it only refers to the previous London Plan 2016. There have been small changes to how this is assessed. So the example here is how carbon offset payment is assessed. Again, this document isn't updated, so it doesn't refer to current policy, and it's therefore not robust or sufficient. So to summarize, the proposal has failed to demonstrate that it will provide the maximum reasonable amount of affordable housing for the site, and subsequently failed to demonstrate the added value of the tall element of the proposal in terms of mixed and balanced communities. Additionally, it's noted that the information provided to support the application in terms of its impact on community space, transport impacts, urban greening, and sustainability is either lacking or significantly outdated, and is therefore not robust enough to demonstrate policy compliance. Therefore, officers recommend that the Strategic Development Committee is asked to note the contents of the update report and resolve to agree the reasons for refusal set out in the report and delegate authority to the Director of Planning and Development to refuse permission based on the reasons for refusal identified in Appendix 1 of the report. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Liam. Just for clarity, and I'm sure the minutes will reflect as well, that we've just also been joined by our colleague, Councillor James Beckles, who is very welcome to participate in the discussion and questions, but because of arriving partway through the item, won't be able to vote. Before we continue, in light of the officer recommendation, which is for refusal, and because the applicants have sadly chosen not to join us tonight, although we don't normally do this, I'm going to suggest that we allow 5 minutes just to make sure that every member has physically had the time to read through the update paper, which includes a letter from the applicant. As I say, we don't always do this, but I'm just keen to make sure that we're entirely fair, given that they've chosen not to be here. I'm going to set a timer on my phone. I know we've had this by email earlier today, but just to give us an extra 5 minutes, just to look through it and make sure that we've given due regard to it. That concludes the 5 minutes I suggest we allow. I note that the letter also requests that the statement is provided to members or ahead of the committee, added to the supplementary agenda and read out on behalf of the applicants. I'm going to suggest, I don't think we necessarily need to read it out. Are committee members content with that?
Yes, Chair.
We've had a read through of it. We've given it due regard. It is a great shame that the applicants have chosen not to be here tonight. But we'll proceed on that basis and be as fair to them as we can. Before I draw in committee members, I just wanted to say, if not for the applicants and if not for members or officers, but just perhaps for the record, how deeply troubling it is to see applications like this coming back with less affordable homes, with fewer family accommodation, with, in this case, a proposal of 0 affordable homes. I know I always say this, that it is impossible to overstate how important genuinely affordable family homes are to the people of Newham. The need that we see as councillors in the surgeries every single week from people living in the most appalling circumstances, working people, often working more than one job, with young children with additional needs, people who've grown up in Newham, their support systems are in Newham, their families and schools and places of work are in Newham, people being taken away from the places that support them because of the nature of the housing crisis in London. And so, you know, obviously everybody talks about how important affordable homes are, and it is our political priority. But I just wanted to impress I sincerely hope the applicant will be watching this in the future, and indeed for anyone else preparing an application for us, that affordable homes are absolutely morally really at the core of what we're trying to do as a council, because without decent places for Newham people where people can afford to live decent lives with enough space, then really nothing else is possible.
Agreed, Chair.
Can I ask members, please, if they have any comments or questions? Councillor Morris.
Chair, I think you may remember there was an application probably about a year ago where I went to the applicant and said, "Who do you think you are?"
I do remember that, yes.
I believe if they were in this room today, I would say the exact same thing. I am deeply shocked by this application. It is perhaps the worst application I've ever seen in my entire experience in SDC. My comments, I actually will start on a positive comment. I disagree with the officers on town centres and densification. I think densification is a good thing. I think the location is right for density, and actually I think it would add value to the community and to my ward. It is a high street, it's not a residential street. I think densification is a good thing. But in terms of the negatives, as you stated, the lack of affordable housing is absolutely shocking. And by the looks of it, it seems like there's a behaviour, a characteristic among the applicant to try to defer from ever providing any affordable housing whatsoever in their entire history. And it was only through the good work of our officers that they managed to shut 12.5% in the last application. I mean, I guess there is a question in there in the sense that what was the communication like in terms of, what was the negotiation like in trying to extract the original 12.5, and what was the process that led the applicant to reverse that provision?
Perhaps I could direct that question to Liam.
Thank you, councillor. I'm afraid the officer who dealt with the original application has left, so I don't know the exact ins and outs of it. But often when we get an application like this, where there's a very low level of affordable housing, the first thing we'll do is go back to the applicant and say, we'll emphasise everything that Councillor Tripp just said about how important it is. And we, really emphasise the fact that even a small amount of affordable housing can outweigh other issues in the scheme. It carries significant weight. So what I imagine would be the case, as has been with other applications I've dealt with, is that discussion would have been had. In that case, they went to committee and it was deferred to give them time to actually look into it and see if they could provide that additional affordable. And in that case, they did. They would argue voluntarily. Our viability assessments say that was a viable amount to provide in the first place. So that's how I would assume those discussions would have gone back then, but I'm afraid I don't know the exact ins and outs. In terms of why it's been dropped since, I don't know much other than what was submitted with the application, just that the costs of build, the cost of materials, the applicant feels that this means that it's no longer viable to provide the 12.5%. It's already been disputed by our own viability assessors. So yeah, I'm afraid that there's not a whole lot more I can add to that discussion, I'm afraid.
One supplementary comment.
Go ahead.
I would also like to comment on the tone of the agent's letter. In the last paragraph, it says, instruct officers to appropriately engage when the applicant on this major development proposal. And not just that, but the assumptions in this letter that our officers haven't been doing their due diligence, when in fact, my personal experience is that our officers tend to be quite amazing in engaging with applicants, guiding them through the application process. And so this seems like an exception, which leads me to suspect that there's no validity behind it. And actually, I think it's a poor representation of the application that the agent decided to make these comments.
I mean, I think following on from that, it's probably only fair to ask Liam or perhaps John to respond to what's said in this letter, where they basically say that they think it's unfair and that this has been brought prematurely to committee and that they wanted, they were looking for some additional negotiation. I wondered if, again, for the record, if you could provide some clarity about why this application is coming to committee now rather than being subject to further negotiation.
Yeah, no problem, Chair. So this is unusual in that we have a previous application which has hit 12.5%. So our fallback, if you like, is that 12.5%. Again, the viability assessors, BNPP, have said 12.5% is viable. So therefore, our position is anything below 12.5% is not something we would support. Given that the applicants have come in with 0%, they already have a scheme for 12.5%. We fail to see what constructive process could come from further negotiations here. We could drag this out for as long as we like, but if the applicant is never going to meet 12.5%, it doesn't seem like there's any real public benefit in doing that, in lengthening that process.
Thank you. I mean, just another further couple of comments from me. One is that 12.5%, which is obviously the one that was approved, is still really a very small proportion of affordable homes. Like, that still does not represent the kind of proportion that we're really looking for, and it goes nowhere near reflecting the need. The other thing that really stands out to me is that I understand, of course, the process of negotiation around viability and debating the figures that go into that and the backwards and forwards, but a negotiation that starts from a developer saying 0% does not seem to me to be a negotiation that's being entered to in good faith. Like, that isn't a good faith starting point. That isn't a starting point that shows the ability to come back and to be flexible. It suggests a lack of ability to negotiate, which suggests to me that the decision to bring to committee was the right one. Councillor Sarli-Pontin, can I bring you in next?
Yeah, thank you. I've got a couple of points that I want to make. First of all, following on with the 12.5%, which is the equivalent of 10 out of 80 flats. And of course, we don't know what the size of those properties would be. We don't know, it hasn't been outlined for whether we're looking at 3-bedroom properties or whether we're looking at 1-bedroom properties. So I couldn't see that in the application at all. Is that stated anywhere?
That would be in the previous application, because obviously this application has no affordable, so they wouldn't have designated any of those units, if you see what I mean. So I'm sure I could find the information, what was approved, what mix was approved, but I'm afraid I don't have it to hand because it's obviously not.
But it's not pertinent at this point, is it? So it doesn't really help us. Secondly, there's been mentioned by yourself and also in the letter we've received that the independent assessors have concluded that the development can support the same level of affordable contribution as previously resolved in 2021. That's quoting the letter from Mandeep. Now, the independent assessors, did they assess to find out how many properties as affordable housing could be afforded, or did they simply assess to see whether 12.5% was affordable?
I'm not sure of the exact details because viability assessments are very technical, and I'm afraid I can't claim to be an expert on them. I do know that they did consider that 12.5% would be marginally viable, so it would meet the threshold, if you like. I think they probably agreed that much more than that is probably not able to be achieved on this site.
Could you
However,
check that for us? Because the language from Mandeep in the letter is not very precise. So it's they're basically using the independent assessor as a validation for their 12.5%, which they haven't even asked for this time around, rather than actually stating to us what the independent assessor said. So it would be useful to know that, because as the chair has stated, there's no way that today we would be passing an application that came in today as 12.5%. You know, we would have great difficulty with that. Can I just come to a couple of other points and then I'll be finished? Again, in the letter, Mandeep states that with regards to officers not being helpful, not engaging in helping to amend and develop the plan. And yet in the application, it actually goes on to state that the applicants haven't also engaged with crime prevention, energy, strategy, transport or greening plans and policy. So it's looking as if the consistent factor in all of this lack of engagement is the applicant. And I think they've just tripped themselves up by trying to claim and be defensive, saying that it's officers' fault, whereas, as I said, they haven't consulted the police, they haven't consulted the energy strategy, they haven't consulted Transport for London, and they haven't consulted current greening plans. Basically, everything's out of date. The transport says 13 years out of date. The parking survey is 6 years out of date. Not providing maximum reasonable amount of affordable housing, which again is out of date. This is very poor, very poor.
Jane, I can see you've raised your virtual hand. Did you want to come in?
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you very much to Councillor Morris for his really lovely comments about my team. And I can confirm that, in my opinion, they are also excellent. But on Councillor Solly Ponten's comments, it's not really up to us to kind of say what the level of affordable housing should be here, because they're offering 0. So what we're saying is 0 isn't acceptable. So we're not kind of arguing what the percentage should be. Thank you.
Thank you. I did want to follow on from Madeline's questions about the viability assessment, just to ask whether officers had any comment on the fact that the amount that the NPP suggested would be viable hasn't changed despite increasing construction costs. I mean, I certainly wouldn't welcome a lower percentage from BNPP, but it does strike me there would be a kind of coherent argument to be made about that. Is that something officers could offer any comment on, or would we need to ask BNPP about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to come back on. I'll just come back to your previous question, Councillor, as well. I've just got the viability review open in front of me. So they did assess a number of scenarios. One was 100% private housing. One was 12.5% with a mix of social rent and shared ownership. One was 10% and one was 16.25%. So there is a sort of, I don't know what you call it, but it's expected that developers will get a 20% kind of profit from a development, and that's always factored into viability assessments. So this works out what the surplus or deficit would be. So in those scenarios, they found that the 12.5% option, which would be 5 London affordable rents and 5 shared ownerships, would be viable. And I think that's where they've drawn their line at 12.5%, which I think actually probably follows on to your question as well, Councillor Tripp, does it, in terms of why the numbers haven't changed? You were talking about material costs, weren't you?
Yeah, it struck me that increased construction costs might have had an impact here and don't seem to have done.
Yeah, so they have factored that into this appraisal in their review. What they also look at though is land values in the area.
Oh,
So
okay.
when I discussed it with the viability officer, when the report was received, they noted that part of the assessment, as I understand it, is the value of the land or the property as it is currently is factored into the viability of the scheme. And in the view of BNPP, the scope of properties in the area isn't wide enough to really get an accurate view of land values. I can't remember east or west. Sorry, I'm afraid I can't remember off the top of my head, but they felt that there was one direction from the site where properties were perhaps more expensive, which weren't taken into consideration, would have an
Mhm.
impact on obviously the final value of the sale of the units when they complete.
I mean, I've no doubt that they're on top of all the detail, but I just think it's helpful for the minutes and in the public session, to draw that out. Another question that I had was, it struck me that the letters from the agent seem to be suggesting that the reason why all of the other information is so out of date is because it pertains to the extant permission, which was obviously 2021. So they were sort of treating this supposed negotiation on the percentage of affordable as kind of like an amendment to the existing permission. And so I just wanted to kind of double check with officers whether we were treating this as an amendment to the existing permission, or as a new application, because, you know, planning law moves on and policies move on, as we can see from the papers. And I just wanted to kind of be clear on that in my head as well, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm sure members are familiar with the Section 73 application where you amend an existing scheme. When that happens, the key issue on that is that the expiry date doesn't change, so you still have the original 3 years. This is a fresh application. It's on a full permission form. The full fee has been paid. It's a fresh application, and therefore, although the existing permission does have a lot of weight in our decision, we do assess it as a fresh application because if this were to be approved, it would have another 3 years to run on top of, you know, the extant permission.
So if the applicant has applied for it as fresh permission and paid the fees for fresh permission, then actually the applicant should be under the impression that we're only negotiating about the affordable. They, to my mind, should know that all of the information that they're sending in should be complying with current planning.
Absolutely,
with current planning policy.
Yeah, even
Okay.
with a Section 73 where policies have changed, the minimum we'd really want would be a cover letter explaining why certain documents remain relevant in the current
Mhm.
policy. In this case, it is just, it's quite literally the previous application has been resubmitted with no
That's
update.
helpful, thank you. Were there further questions or comments?
I agree with the officer's decision, and I'm also not supporting this application because of affordable housing. Yeah, and I do agree with James. The tone of applicant or their representative have used is not appropriate for them. Thank you.
Thank you. In which case, I am going to suggest we move to the vote. Sorry, Madeline, you didn't want to come in again. did you?
I'm nodding.
Okay. In which case, can I suggest we move to the vote? Liam, are you able to share the officer recommendation for us on the screen, please? The recommendation from officers is that Strategic Development Committee is asked to note the contents of the update report and resolve to agree the reasons for refusal as set out in the report and delegate authority to the Director of Planning and Development to refuse planning permission based on the reasons for refusal identified in Appendix 1 of the report. Can I please ask all those in favour to raise their hands? That is unanimous, thank you. And thank you very much to officers for their work on this. That is the only substantive item on the agenda tonight. The last item on the agenda, item 7, is the date of our next meeting, which is the 14th of May. Thank you all very much for your time this evening.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Shirley.
Thank you.
That was a gentle introduction.